The desert wind carried screams that night in Millbrook Junction, and by morning, 7-year-old Tommy Caldwell was gone. What followed was a hunt that would test the limits of human endurance, break every rule of civilized society, and force a broken man to become something far more dangerous than the outlaws who had taken everything that mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Eleanor Caldwell, a widow whose world shattered in a single night, and Marcus Kane, a gunslinger whose own demons made him the only man desperate enough to ride into hell itself. Eleanor Caldwell had always believed that Millbrook Junction was too small for real trouble to find them. The town sat like a forgotten coin in the vast expanse of Arizona territory. Population barely 300 souls, most of them decent folk trying to scratch out honest livings from stubborn earth. The railroad had promised to come through 5 years back, bringing prosperity and growth, but the tracks had curved north instead, leaving Millbrook to slowly fade like an old photograph left too long in the sun. She didn't mind the quiet life. After losing her husband Robert to consumption 2 winters prior, Eleanor had found peace in the predictable rhythms of their small existence. She ran the town's only general store, a narrow building squeezed between McGrath's saloon and the barber shop, its shelves stocked with the necessities that kept frontier life bearable. Flour, coffee, ammunition, medicine, bolts of fabric for the women who still held on to dreams of proper dresses. Tommy helped her in the store after school, his 7-year-old hands surprisingly capable of organizing inventory and counting change. He had his father's steady demeanor, but his mother's bright curiosity, asking endless questions about the travelers who occasionally passed through their town. Why did some men wear their guns tied low? Where did the wagon trains go when they disappeared beyond the eastern hills? Would they ever see an actual Indian war party? Eleanor would ruffle his sandy hair and remind him that some questions were better left unasked. In a place like Millbrook Junction, curiosity could be a dangerous luxury. The morning of September 15th, 1887, began like any other. Eleanor opened the store at 7 sharp. Tommy swept the front steps before heading to the one-room schoolhouse, and Mrs. Henderson stopped by to gossip about the strange riders who'd been seen camping near Devil's Canyon, 3 miles north of town. Eleanor paid little attention to the talk. Drifters were common enough, and most kept to themselves as long as they weren't bothered. She should have listened more carefully. The Brennan gang had been moving south from Colorado for 6 weeks, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and empty graves in their wake. Led by Silas Brennan, a man whose capacity for cruelty had earned him a $5,000 bounty across 3 territories, the gang consisted of 8 men bound together by shared violence and mutual greed. They took what they wanted without regard for law or conscience, and what they wanted most was gold. Brennan had heard rumors about the Millbrook Mining Company's monthly payroll shipment, $20,000 in fresh minted coins that traveled under minimal guard to this small mining operation in the Dragoon Mountains. The shipment always stopped overnight in Millbrook Junction before continuing south, and Brennan had decided that particular detail made the town a necessary part of his plans. What he hadn't counted on was the shipment arriving 3 days late. Gang had been camped in Devil's Canyon for almost a week, growing increasingly restless as they waited for their target to appear. Tempers were running short, whiskey was running low, and some of the men were beginning to question whether Brennan's information had been accurate. By the evening of September 15th, the gang leader had reached a decision that would change everything. If the gold wasn't coming to them, they would take what compensation they could find in Millbrook Junction itself. Eleanor was closing the store when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the north. 8 riders moved down Main Street at a measured pace, their horses' iron shoes striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. Even in the fading light, she could see these weren't ordinary travelers. They sat their saddles with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence, their weapons worn with the casual familiarity of tools rather than ornaments. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with pale eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a black hat pulled low over his forehead and a duster coat that had seen considerable use. When he smiled, which he did often, the expression never reached those cold eyes. Silas Brennan had come calling. The gang spread out as they reached the town center, positioning themselves with military precision at key points along the street. 2 men dismounted outside the saloon. Another pair took positions near the sheriff's office, and the remaining 3 formed a loose perimeter on the general store. It was a deployment designed to control the entire town within minutes, and it worked exactly as intended. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office with his hands already raised, recognizing immediately that resistance would be both futile and fatal. At 63 years old, Morrison was a politician more than a lawman, elected primarily because no one else wanted the job. His deputy had quit the previous month after a dispute over wages, leaving Morrison to face 8 armed killers, with nothing but a rusty badge and a prayer. "Evening, Sheriff," Brennan called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. "Lovely little town you have here. Real peaceful. We're going to do our best to keep it that way." Eleanor watched from her store window as Tommy came running down the street from the schoolhouse, his small legs carrying him toward home, just as he did every evening. Her heart clenched as she realized he was heading directly into the middle of whatever was about to unfold. She stepped onto the wooden sidewalk and called softly, "Tommy, come here quickly." The boy looked up and saw the riders, his steps slowing, as he processed the tension that had suddenly filled the familiar street. Eleanor held out her hand and smiled, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "Just some travelers, sweetheart. Come help Mama lock up the store." Tommy nodded and started toward her, but one of Brennan's men, a heavy-set brute named Dutch Kowalski, had already noticed the boy. Something in the child's bright, intelligent eyes seemed to trigger a thought in the outlaw's mind. "Hey, boss," Kowalski called out. "Look what we got here." Brennan turned his attention to Tommy, studying the boy with the same calculating interest he might show a particularly valuable piece of livestock. Eleanor felt ice form in her veins as she recognized the look. "Come here, son," Brennan said, gently dismounting from his horse. "Don't be afraid. We're just passing through." Tommy looked uncertainly between his mother and the stranger. Eleanor started forward, every maternal instinct screaming danger, but found her path blocked by another gang member who had moved to intercept her. Now," the man said with false friendliness. "Let the boy make his own choices. Tommy, come." "To me right now," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with command, but Brennan was already walking toward the child, his movements unhurried and deliberate. When he reached Tommy, he knelt down to bring himself to the boy's eye level, his pale gaze fixing on the child's face with unsettling intensity. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Caldwell, sir." "Tommy Caldwell. That's a fine, strong name. Tell me, Tommy, does your mama run that store over there?" The boy nodded, glancing nervously toward Eleanor, who was now being held firmly in place by 2 armed men. "And I bet she's got some money in that store, doesn't she? Maybe in a strongbox or a safe?" Tommy's confusion was evident. At 7 years old, he didn't understand the implications of the question, only that something was wrong with the way the strange man was looking at him. I don't know, sir." Brennan smiled that cold smile again and stood up, his decision made. In his experience, nothing motivated cooperation quite like the proper leverage, and children made the most effective leverage of all. "Well, Tommy Caldwell, I think you're going to come with us for a little while. Just until your mama and I can work out some business arrangements." Eleanor screamed as Brennan lifted Tommy onto his horse, the sound echoing off the false-fronted buildings like a wounded animal's cry. She fought against the men holding her, her desperation lending her strength she didn't know she possessed, but it wasn't enough. "Please," she gasped. "He's just a child. Take whatever you want from the store, but leave my son alone." "Oh, we'll take what we want from the store," Brennan assured her, settling Tommy in front of him on the saddle. The boy was crying now, reaching toward his mother with small, desperate hands. "But your boy here is going to make sure you and everyone else in this town stay real cooperative while we conduct our business." The next 2 hours were a nightmare of systematic looting. The gang moved through Millbrook Junction like a plague of locusts, taking money, weapons, supplies, and anything else that caught their fancy. They emptied Eleanor's store, cleaned out the saloon's till, and forced Sheriff Morrison to open the town's small safe. When they were finished, they had collected nearly $800 in cash and goods, not the fortune they'd been seeking, but enough to make their time worthwhile. Eleanor stood in her ransacked store, surrounded by scattered merchandise and broken dreams, watching through the window as the gang prepared to depart. Tommy sat motionless on Brennan's horse, his small face pale but determined not to cry anymore. Brennan walked his horse close to the store window and looked directly at Eleanor, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of ice. "We'll be in touch about terms for the boy's return," he said conversationally. "Don't bother following us. Don't bother sending for help. If we see any pursuit, or if any law shows up asking questions, the boy dies. Understand?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor nodded mutely, her throat too tight for words. "Good, we'll send word in a week or so about what we want for him. Until then, he'll be safe as long as everyone stays smart." The gang rode out of Millbrook Junction in the same orderly fashion they'd arrived, disappearing into the darkness beyond the town limits like shadows returning to whatever hell had spawned them. Eleanor stood at her window until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then collapsed to her knees among the debris of her former life. Tommy was gone. The townspeople gathered in the aftermath, their faces reflecting the same helpless rage that burned in Eleanor's chest. Sheriff Morrison muttered about sending word to the territorial marshal, but everyone knew help was days away at best. The gang could be anywhere by then, and Tommy with them. Mrs. Henderson tried to offer comfort, but Eleanor barely heard the words. Dr. Pritchard, the town's physician, suggested she take laudanum to help her sleep, but she refused. Sleep would bring dreams, and dreams would bring hope, and hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. As the night wore on and the well-meaning neighbors gradually returned to their homes, Eleanor found herself alone in her destroyed store, staring at the empty space where her life used to be. The silence was broken only by the wind rattling the loose boards of the building, and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the desert. She had no money to hire professional help. She had no connections to powerful men who might intervene. She had nothing but a mother's desperate love and a burning need for justice that threatened to consume her from the inside. That's when she remembered the stories about Marcus Kane. Kane was a name whispered in saloons and around campfires, usually late at night when men had drunk enough to loosen their tongues, but not enough to forget their fears. He'd been a lawman once, they said, a deputy marshal with a reputation for never giving up on a case. But something had broken in him during the war, and what emerged from those bloody years was something altogether different. Now he was a hired gun, a man who took the jobs that regular lawmen wouldn't touch and solved problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. He was expensive, dangerous, and utterly without mercy when it came to the men who hired his services. More importantly, he was said to have a particular hatred for outlaws who preyed on innocent people. Eleanor had heard he was in Tombstone, drinking away his latest fee in the saloons along Allen Street. It was a 3-day ride south, assuming she could find someone willing to take her. The journey would cost her the last of her savings, and there was no guarantee Kane would even listen to her story, much less agree to help. But as she stood in the ruins of her store, holding one of Tommy's small shirts that had been trampled during the robbery, Eleanor realized she didn't have a choice. The law couldn't help her. The townspeople couldn't help her. If she wanted her son back, she would have to find someone willing to follow Silas Brennan into whatever dark corner of hell he called home. Marcus Kane might be a broken man, but sometimes it took something broken to fix what had been shattered. Beyond repair. As dawn broke over Millbrook Junction, Eleanor Caldwell was already packing for the longest journey of her life. The Oriental Saloon in Tombstone reeked of stale tobacco, spilled whiskey, and broken dreams. It was past midnight on September 18th when Eleanor Caldwell pushed through the batwing doors, her travel-stained dress and hollow eyes drawing curious stares from the late-night crowd. She'd never been inside a saloon before, never imagined she'd have reason to, but desperation had a way of rewriting the rules of proper behavior. The bartender, a portly man with graying whiskers, looked up from polishing glasses with obvious disapproval. Women of Eleanor's apparent respectability didn't venture into establishments like his, especially not alone and at this hour. "Ma'am, I think you might be looking for the hotel," he said diplomatically. "It's just down the street." "I'm looking for Marcus Kane," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was told he might be here." The bartender's expression shifted from disapproval to caution. Several conversations around the room grew quieter, and Eleanor became aware of eyes watching her with new interest. The name Marcus Kane carried weight in Tombstone, and not the comfortable kind. "That corner table," the bartender said after a moment's hesitation. "But lady, you might want to reconsider whatever business you think you have with him. Kane ain't the sort of man decent folk usually seek out." Eleanor followed his gaze to a shadowy corner where a solitary figure sat hunched over a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Even in the dim lamplight, she could see this was a man who'd been carved hollow by experiences too dark to name. Marcus Kane looked like he was trying to drown something that refused to die. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely gray hair and a face that might have been handsome before whatever demons had claimed it. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind a successful man might wear after he'd stopped caring about success. Two Colt peacemakers hung low on his hips, their grips smooth with use, and his right hand never strayed far from the nearest weapon. Eleanor approached his table with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. Kane didn't look up when she stopped beside him, continuing to stare into his glass as if it contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Mr. Kane?" He took a slow sip of whiskey before acknowledging her presence. When he finally raised his eyes, Eleanor was struck by their color, pale blue, like winter sky, but empty of warmth or hope. "Lady, if you're looking for a hired gun, I'm between jobs and not particularly interested in starting a new one. If you're looking for company, you've got the wrong man entirely. Either way, I'd suggest you turn around and walk back out that door." His voice was rough with whiskey and disuse, carrying the flat inflection of a man who'd said goodbye to caring about anything beyond his next drink. But Eleanor had come too far and risked too much to be dismissed so easily. "My son was taken 3 days ago," she said, settling uninvited into the chair across from him. "Stolen by outlaws who rode into our town like they owned it. The law can't help me, and I have nowhere else to turn." Kane's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly around the glass. "Ma'am, there are dozens of missing children across this territory. Apashas, Mexicans, bandits, slavers, plenty of folks in the business of taking things that don't belong to them. What makes you think your boy is any different?" "Because I know who took him," Eleanor replied. "Silas Brennan and his gang. They're holding him for ransom, and they'll kill him if anyone tries to follow." Now Kane looked at her directly, his pale eyes focusing with the sharp attention of a predator scenting prey. The name Silas Brennan had accomplished what Eleanor's desperate plea could not. It had penetrated the alcoholic haze that seemed to surround him like armor. "Brennan," he repeated slowly. "You sure about that?" I spoke to him face to face. Pale eyes, neat beard, rides with 7 other men. He knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. This wasn't random violence, it was business. Kane was quiet for a long moment, turning the whiskey glass in his hands while something worked behind those empty eyes. When he spoke, again, his voice carried a different quality, harder and more focused. "Silas Brennan killed my partner 2 years ago in Colorado. Shot him in the back while he was trying to arrest one of Brennan's men for rape and murder. Good man, Jake Morrison. Had a wife and 3 children waiting for him in Denver." Eleanor felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. "Then you understand why I'm here." "I understand why you think you're here," Kane corrected. "But what you're asking for isn't justice, lady. It's revenge. And revenge is a luxury that usually costs more than people can afford to pay." He poured another measure of whiskey and drank it down in one smooth motion. "Brennan doesn't take prisoners for ransom. He takes them for leverage, and he kills them when they're no longer useful. If your boy is still alive, it's only because Brennan hasn't finished whatever he's planning." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain steady. She'd known the truth before coming here. Hearing it spoken aloud only made it impossible to ignore. "How much?" she asked. Kane's laugh was bitter and empty. "How much what?" "How much to bring my son home?" "You can't afford me, lady. My last job paid $3,000, and that was for tracking down a single man who'd stolen some cattle. What you're talking about is a war against 8 killers who know how to disappear into a country where the law fears to tread." Eleanor reached into her reticule and placed every dollar she possessed on the scarred wooden table. $237, the accumulated savings of 3 years of careful frugality. It represented the deed to her store, her late husband's pocket watch, her mother's wedding ring, and every other item of value she'd been able to liquidate during her desperate journey south. "It's everything I have," she said simply. "Everything I am and everything I ever will be. If it's not enough, then I'll find another way." Kane stared at the money with an expression she couldn't read. "What other way? I'll go after them myself." The Gunslinger's reaction was immediate and sharp. "You'll get yourself killed inside of a day. Brennan would probably keep you alive long enough to have some entertainment with you first, but the end result would be the same. You'd be dead, your boy would be dead, and Brennan would ride away to do the same thing to someone else." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Then help me prevent that." Something shifted in Kane's face, a crack appearing in the wall of indifference he'd built around himself. He pushed back from the table and walked to the bar, leaving Eleanor sitting alone with her pathetic pile of money and her desperate hopes. She watched him order another bottle, expecting him to disappear into it the way broken men usually did. Instead, he returned to the table and sat down with the unopened whiskey between them like a challenge. "Tell me about your boy," he said. Eleanor blinked, surprised by the request. "His name is Tommy. He's 7 years old, smart as a whip and braver than he should be. He helps me run our store, and he asks more questions than any child has a right to. He wants to be a sheriff when he grows up, because he thinks lawmen help people who can't help themselves." Kane's expression grew even more distant. "What happened to his father?" "Consumption, 2 winters ago. Robert was a good man, gentle and kind. He never carried a gun in his life, never raised his hand in anger to anyone. Tommy barely remembers him, but he's trying so hard to grow up, to be the man he thinks his father was. And you think hiring a killer to get him back is what his father would have wanted?" The question was asked quietly, but it carried the weight of genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Eleanor considered it carefully before answering. "I think his father would have wanted his son to come home alive," she said finally. "However that had to happen. Kane nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. He opened the new bottle of whiskey and poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the table to Eleanor. "I don't drink," she said. "Tonight you do," Kane replied. "If you're going to hire me to kill people, you're going to understand what that means." Eleanor picked up the glass with trembling fingers and took a small sip. The whiskey burned her throat and brought tears to her eyes, but she managed not to cough. "I was a deputy marshal for 6 years, Kane said, settling back in his chair. "Served under Judge Parker in Fort Smith, chasing killers and thieves across Indian Territory. Jake Morrison was my partner for the last 3 years, and he was the best lawman I ever knew. Patient, thorough, always gave a man a chance to surrender before he drew his weapon." He took a drink and continued. "We were tracking Brennan's gang after they hit a stagecoach near Pueblo. 3 passengers dead, including a pregnant woman. Jake wanted to take them alive if possible, bring them back for trial. I thought we should kill them all and save the territory the expense of rope." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to come. "We found them camped in a box canyon, figured we had them trapped. Jake went in to negotiate their surrender while I covered him from the rocks above." Brennan listened to his whole speech about justice and due process, nodded like he was considering it, then put a bullet in Jake's spine while he was turning to leave. Kane's hand tightened around the glass. "I killed 4 of them before they got to cover. Would have killed them all, but they had hostages from the stagecoach robbery. 2 children, younger than your boy. Brennan used them as shields while his gang shot their way out of the canyon. What happened to the children? Found their bodies 3 days later, 20 miles north. Brennan had put bullets in their heads when they were no longer useful." Kane's voice was completely flat now, drained of all emotion. "That's when I stopped being a lawman and started being something else." Eleanor felt sick, but she forced herself to ask the necessary question. "Will you help me?" Kane studied her face for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was looking for something specific in her expression. Finally, he reached across the table and picked up her money, counting it slowly. $237, he said. "Not nearly enough for what you're asking." Eleanor's heart sank, but Kane wasn't finished. "But I'm not doing this for your money," he continued. "I'm doing it because Silas Brennan needs to die, and your boy deserves better than what happened to those children in Colorado. Keep your money. You'll need it to rebuild your life after this is over." The relief that flooded through Eleanor was so intense she nearly collapsed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Kane warned. "What I'm about to do isn't rescue work, it's extermination. There won't be any arrests or trials or opportunities for redemption. I'm going to track down every member of Brennan's gang and kill them all. If that bothers you, now would be a good time to find a different solution." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "It doesn't bother me." Kane studied her face again, then nodded. "We leave at first light. I'll need tonight to gather supplies and information. Brennan's got friends in Tucson who might know where he's headed, and I know a few people who owe me favors." He stood up from the table, leaving the opened whiskey bottle behind. "Get yourself a room at the hotel and try to sleep. Tomorrow we start hunting, and once we're on their trail, there won't be time for rest until it's finished." Eleanor watched him walk toward the saloon doors, then called after him. "Mr. Kane, why are you really doing this?" He paused without turning around. "Because some debts can only be paid in blood," he said quietly. "And I've been carrying this one too long." After he left, Eleanor sat alone at the table, staring at the money she'd been prepared to sacrifice. Around her, the saloon continued its nightly ritual of drowning sorrows and celebrating small victories. But she felt separated from it all by the magnitude of what lay ahead. Tomorrow, she would begin a journey into darkness alongside a man who'd chosen to become a monster in order to fight monsters. She should have been terrified, should have questioned the wisdom of trusting her son's life to someone who spoke of killing with such casual certainty. Instead, for the first time since Tommy had been taken, Eleanor Caldwell felt something that resembled hope. Outside, the desert wind carried the promise of violence across the empty miles between Tombstone and whatever hell Silas Brennan called home. The hunt was about to begin. Dawn broke, gray and merciless over Tombstone, as Marcus Kane loaded the last of his supplies into his saddlebags. He'd spent the night making preparations that spoke to years of hunting dangerous men across unforgiving terrain. Extra ammunition, medical supplies, dried food for 2 weeks, water purification tablets, and a small arsenal of specialized weapons that most lawmen never carried. Eleanor watched from the hotel porch as he worked, noting the methodical precision with which he approached every task. This wasn't a man rushing into action driven by emotion. This was a professional killer preparing for war. Kane's horse was a magnificent black stallion named Tempest, 17 hands high, with intelligent eyes and the lean musculature of an animal bred for endurance rather than speed. The beast stood perfectly still as Kane secured his gear, occasionally turning its head to study Eleanor with what seemed like deliberate assessment. "He isn't like most people," Kane said, noticing her attention. "But he saved my life more times than I can count. Out there, your horse isn't just transportation, it's your lifeline." Eleanor's own mount was a sturdy bay mare Kane had procured from the local livery stable. Nothing fancy, but reliable and sure-footed on rough terrain. She'd never ridden for more than a few hours at a time, and the prospect of days in the saddle filled her with dread she tried not to show. "You sure about this?" Kane asked as he helped her adjust her stirrups. "Once we leave town, there's no changing your mind. What we're riding into isn't going to be like anything you've experienced." "I'm sure," Eleanor replied, though her voice carried more conviction than she felt. Kane studied her face, then nodded. "Keep the canteen close and drink water even when you're not thirsty. Desert will kill you with dehydration before you realize what's happening. If I tell you to do something, do it immediately without questions. And if shooting starts, get low and stay down until I tell you otherwise." They rode out of Tombstone. As the sun cleared the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Kane had visited 3 different contacts the night before, piecing together fragments of information about Brennan's movements and possible destinations. The gang had been seen heading southeast toward the Dragoon Mountains, following old Apache trails that would keep them away from established roads and towns. The first day's ride was a lesson in survival that Eleanor learned through painful experience. The desert sun was merciless, reflecting off rocks and sand to create a furnace that seemed determined to bake the moisture from every living thing. Kane set a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting their horses, stopping regularly to rest in whatever shade they could find. "Brennan's smart," Kane explained during one of these breaks, sharing water from his canteen with Eleanor. "He knows this country better than most, and he's got bolt holes scattered across 3 territories. We're not just chasing him, we're trying to predict where he'll go to ground." Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead with a handkerchief that was already soaked through. "How do you know so much about him?" "I've been tracking him on and off for 2 years," Kane replied. "Ever since Jake died. Brennan's got patterns, habits he can't break. He likes to winter in Mexico, but he needs to resupply before crossing the border. There are only a few places in this region where he can do that safely." By evening, they'd covered nearly 40 miles, following a barely visible trail that wound through increasingly desolate country. Kane chose their campsite carefully, a small depression surrounded by rocks that would provide concealment and defensive positions if needed. He allowed no fire, serving cold beans and hardtack for dinner, while the desert slowly cooled around them. "Tell me about the other gang members," Eleanor said. Grateful for the chance to rest her aching body, Kane pulled a worn notebook from his pocket. and opened it to a page covered with names and descriptions. Dutch Kowalski, the big one who grabbed. Your boy, he's wanted for murder in Kansas and rape in Colorado. Likes to use a knife when he kills. Charlie Voss and Pete Rodriguez are brothers-in-law, bank robbers from New Mexico. Both fast with guns but not particularly bright. Miguel Santos is their tracker, an ex-cavalry scout who went bad after the war. Thomas Garrett and Jim Sullivan are the muscle former buffalo hunters who graduated to killing people for money. Eleanor listened with growing horror as Kane methodically described each man's crimes and capabilities. These weren't desperate outlaws driven to robbery by circumstance. They were predators who'd chosen violence as a way of life. And the eighth man? She asked. Kane's expression darkened. Billy Brennan, Silas's younger brother. 19 years. Old and already responsible for at least 6 murders. Silas has been grooming him since he was a child, turning him into something even worse than the rest of them. Billy likes to torture his victims before he kills them, and he has a particular fondness for children. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Eleanor felt sick thinking about Tommy in the hands of such monsters, but she forced herself to ask the question that had been haunting her. Will they hurt him? King was quiet for a long moment. Not immediately, he said finally. Brennan needs Tommy alive and unharmed for leverage. But the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. Men like Billy Brennan don't stay controlled forever. They slept in shifts that night, Kane taking the first watch while Eleanor tried to find comfort on the hard ground. The desert night was alive with sounds, coyotes calling in the distance. The scurry of small animals, the whisper of wind through the rocks. Every noise made her think of her son, alone and frightened somewhere in this vast wilderness. When Kane woke her for the second watch, the stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any human light. He handed her a rifle and showed her how to hold it properly. Point and shoot, he said simply. Don't try to be fancy. If anyone approaches this camp who isn't me, kill them. Ask questions later. Eleanor had never held a weapon in her life, but the weight of the rifle felt surprisingly natural in her hands. She settled into position behind the rocks and began her lonely vigil, watching shadows move across the moonlit landscape. The second day brought them into rougher country, where the trail climbed through rocky passes and descended into hidden valleys that seemed untouched by civilization. Kane's tracking skills were remarkable to watch. He could read stories in disturbed stones and broken twigs that were invisible to Eleanor's untrained eyes. 8 riders, moving fast, he said, kneeling beside a patch of soft earth. These tracks are maybe 36 hours old. They're pushing their horses harder than they should, which means they're either running from something or running toward something. Which do you think it is? Kane stood and dusted off his hands. Both. Brennan's got law from 3 territories looking for him, but he's also got a schedule to keep. If he's heading for Mexico, like I think, he needs to reach the border before winter sets in. They pressed on through the afternoon heat, following a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of nowhere. The landscape was alien and hostile, all thorns and sharp rocks and creatures designed to kill anything foolish enough to venture into their domain. Eleanor began to understand why outlaws chose such a country for their hiding places. It was a natural fortress that demanded everything from anyone who dared enter Dot as evening approached. Kane called a halt at the edge of a vast canyon that dropped away into purple shadows. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their horses breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Skeleton Canyon, Kane said, pointing into the depths. Apache used to use it as a stronghold until the army drove them out. Now it belongs to whoever's desperate enough to claim it. Eleanor peered into the canyon and felt her heart sink. The walls were steep and treacherous, cut by erosion into a maze of passages and hidden chambers. If Brennan's gang was down there, they could hide for months without being found. How do we find them and all that? she asked. Kane was studying the ground near the canyon rim, his expression grim. "We don't have to find them," he said quietly. "They already know we're here." He pointed to a series of rocks that had been carefully arranged in a pattern near the edge. To Eleanor's untrained eye, they looked like random debris, but Kane read them like a message. "It's a sign," he explained, "used by scouts to communicate with the main group. Someone's been watching us for hours, tracking our progress. They know exactly who we are and why we're here." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. "What does that mean?" Kane was already moving, checking his weapons and scanning the surrounding terrain for threats. "It means Brennan's done running. He's decided to make a stand, probably because he thinks he can use your boy as a shield to guarantee his escape." A gunshot echoed across the canyon, the sound bouncing off the rock walls in a series of diminishing echoes. Kane grabbed Eleanor's arm and pulled her behind a boulder, just as a second shot sent fragments of stone flying from where she'd been standing. "They're in the rocks above us," Kane said, his voice calm despite the danger. "At least 2 rifles. Maybe more. They've got the high ground and probably know every inch of this terrain." Another shot rang out, followed by the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing overhead. Kane raised his head carefully above their cover, studying the canyon rim with the patient attention of a predator. "There," he said, pointing to a flash of movement among the rocks. 200 yards, just below that dead tree. "Charlie Voss, if I'm not mistaken." He raised his rifle and fired in one smooth motion. A scream echoed across the canyon, followed by the clatter of a weapon falling on stone. The shooting stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence. "One down," Kane said, already moving to a new position. "But they'll have us pinned here until dark unless we do something about it." Eleanor pressed herself against the rock, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it could be heard across the canyon. This was real combat, life and death played out, with bullets and blood, and she was hopelessly out of her depth. Kane seemed to read her thoughts. "Stay here and keep your head down," he ordered. "I'm going to work my way around behind them. If I'm not back in an hour, ride for Tombstone and don't look back." "What about Tommy?" Kane's pale eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something almost like compassion in their depths. "If I don't come back, your boy's already dead," he said simply. "Don't throw your life away trying to save someone who can't be saved." He disappeared into the rocks like a ghost, leaving Eleanor alone with her rifle and her terror. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, marked only by the occasional crack of distant gunfire and the echo of voices shouting across the canyon. When the silence finally returned, it was absolute and final. Eleanor waited in her hiding place as the sun set and darkness crept across the desert, wondering if she would ever see another dawn. Then she heard footsteps approaching through the rocks, and Marcus Kane emerged from the shadows with blood on his clothes and grim satisfaction in his eyes. "It's finished," he said quietly. "2 of them won't be troubling anyone anymore." Eleanor wanted to ask about the details, wanted to know how he'd managed to outfight 2 armed men in their own territory, but something in his expression warned her that some questions were better left unasked. "What now?" she whispered. Kane looked toward the canyon where shadows were gathering like dark water. "Now we go down into the Devil's Playground," he said, "and we find your son." Skeleton Canyon at night was a labyrinth carved from nightmares. Marcus Kane led Eleanor down a treacherous path that seemed to exist more in his memory than in any visible reality, their horses picking their way through loose scree and around fallen boulders the size of houses. The walls rose on either side, like the ribs of some ancient beast, blocking out most of the starlight and creating a world of shifting shadows and whispered echoes. Eleanor's hands were raw from gripping the reins, her legs cramped from hours of careful navigation through terrain that could kill with a single misstep. But physical discomfort paled beside the growing dread that filled her chest with each downward step. Somewhere in this maze of stone and darkness, her son was being held by men who measured human life in dollars and convenience. Cain moved with the silent confidence of a predator in familiar territory. He'd been in places like this before, Eleanor realized, hunting other dangerous men through other deadly landscapes. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it reminded her of what she'd hired him to become. "There," Cain whispered, pointing to a faint glow emanating from a side canyon about half a mile ahead. "Campfire. They're not trying to hide anymore, which means they think they're safe." Eleanor squinted into the darkness but could barely make out the subtle orange flicker against the canyon walls. Cain's eyes were adapted to this work in ways hers would never be. "How many?" she asked. Cain studied the distant light for several minutes, occasionally tilting his head as if listening for sounds too faint for normal ears to detect. "6 horses," he said finally. "Maybe 7. And I can smell bacon cooking, which means they're comfortable enough for hot meals." Brennan's feeling confident. They dismounted and secured their horses in a protected alcove, then began the careful approach on foot. Cain moved like smoke through the darkness, each step placed with deliberate precision to avoid loose stones or brittle vegetation that might betray their presence. Eleanor followed as best she could, trying to match his movements while fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. As they drew closer, voices began to emerge from the general murmur of the camp. Eleanor's heart leaped when she heard a child's voice among them, high, frightened, but unmistakably alive. Tommy was still breathing, still whole enough to speak. The relief was so intense she nearly sobbed aloud. Cain's hand on her shoulder was the only thing that kept her from rushing forward. His pale eyes met hers in the darkness, and she saw understanding there along with a warning. They were close. Now, close enough that a single sound could mean death for all of them. The gang's camp occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon wall, protected on 3 sides by sheer rock and accessible only through a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. It was a perfect fortress for men who lived by violence, offering security and multiple escape routes if needed. From their concealed position among the rocks, Eleanor could see the entire scene laid out before them like a stage play. 6 men sat around a small fire, their weapons close at hand but not immediately ready. They were relaxed, confident in their safety, passing a bottle of whiskey and arguing about something in low voices. Tommy sat apart from the others, his small form huddled against a boulder near the back of the camp. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see he was unharmed but terrified, his young face pale in the firelight. A rope tied him to the rock, long enough to allow some movement, but short enough to prevent any thoughts of escape. Silas Brennan lounged near the fire with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous predator in any room. His pale eyes reflected the flames as he gestured with one hand while speaking, and Eleanor was struck again by how ordinary he appeared. Evil, she'd learned, didn't always announce itself with horns and fangs. Dutch Kowalski sat sharpening a knife with long, deliberate strokes, occasionally glancing toward Tommy with an expression that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The big man's face showed the kind of anticipation that suggested he was looking forward to using that blade for something other than cutting rope. Billy Brennan, the younger brother Cain had described, was pacing restlessly around the edge of the camp. Even at 19, he radiated a nervous energy that spoke of barely controlled violence. His hand never strayed far from his gun, and his eyes darted constantly between the canyon entrance and the boy tied to the rock. Cain studied the scene with professional detachment, counting weapons and noting positions with the methodical attention of a chess master planning several moves ahead. Eleanor watched him work and realized she was seeing a master craftsman prepare for his life's work. 6 men, Cain whispered. All armed, but only 2 are really alert. Brennan's overconfident, and the others are following his lead. What about Tommy? Cain's expression grew grim. He's tied up right in the middle of their killing ground. Any shooting starts, he's in immediate danger from crossfire. We need to get him clear before the real violence begins." Eleanor felt her heart sink. How? Kane was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes never leaving the scene below. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd made an irrevocable decision. "You're going to walk down there and surrender." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "What?" "They're expecting pursuit, but they're not expecting a woman to walk into their camp alone. It'll confuse them, make them hesitate just long enough for me to get into position." The plan was insane, suicidal, and completely against every instinct Eleanor possessed. But as she watched her son sitting alone and terrified in the midst of 6 killers, she realized Kane was right. Conventional approaches wouldn't work here. Sometimes the only way to save something precious was to risk everything. What do I say to them? Kane pulled a small derringer from his boot and pressed it into her hand. "Tell them you're here to negotiate for your boy's release. Keep them talking. Keep their attention focused on you. When I make my move, you get Tommy behind that big boulder on the right side of the camp and stay there until the shooting stops." Eleanor looked at the tiny weapon in her palm. It held only 2 shots, hardly enough to fight 6 armed men. But Kane wasn't asking her to fight. He was asking her to be bait. "And if something goes wrong?" Kane's smile was cold and empty. "Then shoot Silas Brennan in the face and use the second bullet on yourself. Don't let them take you alive." The words should have terrified her, but instead Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her mind. The maternal desperation that had driven her across hundreds of miles of hostile territory crystallized into something harder and more focused. She was no longer a frightened widow begging for help. She was a mother preparing to fight for her child's life. Kane began working his way around the camp's perimeter, moving from shadow to shadow with the patience of a man who understood that haste meant death. Eleanor watched him disappear into the darkness, then took a deep breath and began her descent toward the fire. She made no attempt at stealth, letting her footsteps echo off the canyon walls as she approached. The effect on the camp was immediate and dramatic. Weapons appeared in hands with practiced speed, and 6 sets of eyes turned toward the sound of her approach. "That's far enough," Silas Brennan called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Step into the light where we can see you." Eleanor emerged from the shadows with her hands raised, the derringer concealed in her palm but ready for use. The men around the fire stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to naked hunger, but none of them seemed to view her as an immediate threat. "Well, well," Brennan said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Eleanor Caldwell, I presume. The devoted mother comes calling." Tommy saw her and started to cry out, but Dutch Kowalski's massive hand clamped over the boy's mouth before any sound could emerge. The big man's eyes promised terrible things if the child made any noise. "I've come to talk," Eleanor said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "About terms for my son's release." Brennan laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Talk? Lady, you just walked into a den of wolves with nothing but good intentions and maternal instinct. What exactly do you think we have to discuss?" "Money," Eleanor replied. "You took Tommy for ransom. I'm here to pay for it." Billy Brennan had stopped pacing and was studying Eleanor with the kind of attention a snake might pay to a wounded bird. "She's lying," he said, his young voice carrying an ugly edge. "No way she came here alone. Someone's out there in the dark." Silas raised a hand to silence his brother, but his pale eyes never left Eleanor's face. "Is that true, Mrs. Caldwell? Did you bring help to our little family gathering?" Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I hired a guide to get me here. He's waiting with the horses at the canyon entrance. This is between you and me." "A guide," Brennan mused. "How wonderfully civilized. And what exactly are you prepared to offer for your boy's safe return?" Eleanor reached slowly into her coat and produced the roll of bills Kane had insisted she keep. $500. Everything I have left in the world. Dutch Kowalski snorted with derision. 500? Hell, we took more than that from your penny ante town. But Brennan held up a hand for silence, his calculating mind working through possibilities Eleanor couldn't begin to guess. $500, he repeated thoughtfully. A princely sum for a small-town shopkeeper. Tell me, Mrs. Caldwell, what makes you think your boy is worth so much to us alive? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Eleanor realized with growing horror that she'd walked into something far more complex than a simple ransom. Demand. These men weren't just holding Tommy for money. They were enjoying the power it gave them over her. He's worth everything to me, she said simply. Brennan smiled that cold smile again. I'm sure he is. But you see, we've grown rather fond of young Tommy. He's been quite entertaining, full of questions about where we're going and what we plan to do with him. Children have such wonderful imaginations. Eleanor's hand tightened around the derringer as she fought to keep her expression neutral. Where was Kane? How long was she supposed to keep these monsters talking? Billy here has developed quite an attachment to the boy, Brennan continued conversationally. He was just telling me how much he's looking forward to teaching Tommy some of the lessons our father taught us about pain and obedience. Billy's laugh was high and wild, the sound of madness barely held in check. Kid's got spirit, he said. Be fun to break it. Eleanor felt something snap inside her chest, a sound like ice cracking under pressure. The careful control she'd maintained throughout this nightmare began to dissolve, replaced by a rage so pure it felt like flame in her veins. You touch my son, she said quietly, and I'll kill you myself. The threat should have been laughable, coming from a small woman facing 6 armed killers, but something in Eleanor's voice made the camp fall silent. Even Billy stopped his nervous pacing to stare at her with new attention. Brennan raised an eyebrow. My, the lamb has teeth after all. How refreshing. That's when the first shot rang out from the darkness beyond the camp, and Marcus Kane announced his presence to the Devil's Playground. The first shot exploded from the darkness like thunder, and Pete Rodriguez's head snapped back in a spray of blood and bone. He toppled backward into the fire, sending sparks and burning wood cascading across the camp as his body convulsed once and lay still. The remaining 5 outlaws dove for cover with the practiced speed of men who'd survived countless gunfights. But Kane's opening move had already shattered their sense of security. Eleanor didn't hesitate. The moment gunfire erupted, she lunged toward Tommy, her small derringer forgotten as maternal instinct overrode everything else. Dutch Kowalski was faster, his massive frame intercepting her path with brutal efficiency. His backhanded blow sent her sprawling across the rocky ground, her vision exploding into stars and her mouth filling with the taste of blood. Kill the bitch! Billy Brennan screamed, his young voice cracking with hysteria as he fired wildly into the darkness beyond the camp. His bullets sparked off stone and whined into the night, accomplishing nothing but revealing his position to the predator stalking them. Kane's second shot answered from a different location entirely. The muzzle flash briefly illuminating his pale face among the rocks. Miguel Santos, the gang's tracker, spun sideways as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, his rifle spinning away into the shadows. He tried to crawl behind a boulder, leaving a trail of dark blood on the pale stone. Silas Brennan had taken cover behind a pile of saddles and supplies, his mind working with cold calculation even as chaos erupted around him. Unlike his men, he wasn't panicking. He'd survived too many ambushes to lose his head now, and he could already see the tactical situation developing. It's just one man, he shouted over the gunfire. Kowalski, get to the boy. Sullivan, circle left and flank him. Jim Sullivan nodded and began working his way around the camp's perimeter, using the scattered boulders for cover. He was a steady killer, not given to the wild shooting that had already wasted half of Billy's ammunition. Kane would have to deal with him quickly or risk being caught in crossfire. Eleanor struggled to her hands and knees, her head ringing from Kowalski's blow. Through the haze of pain and confusion, she could see Tommy still tied to his boulder, his small face pale with terror as bullets flew overhead. The boy was trying to make himself as small as possible, pressing against the rock like he could somehow disappear into its surface. Dutch. Kowalski was moving toward Tommy with purposeful strides, a gleaming knife in his massive fist. His intention was clear. If the gang couldn't win this fight, they would at least deny their enemy his prize. Eleanor saw death approaching her son and felt something break loose inside her chest. Something primal and unstoppable. She found the derringer where it had fallen and brought it up in both hands, the tiny weapon seeming impossibly small against the mountain of flesh advancing on her child. Kowalski saw the gun and laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Go ahead, little lady," he taunted. "See what that toy does against a real man." Eleanor pulled the trigger. The derringer's bark was sharp and angry in the confined space, and Kowalski's laugh cut off abruptly as the bullet took him in the throat. He stood there for a moment, surprised by the sudden flow of blood cascading down his chest, then toppled forward like a felled tree. His knife clattered harmlessly across the stone as his life pumped out through his fingers. Kane's third shot dropped. Thomas Garrett as the outlaw tried to rush his position. The bullet caught Garrett's center mass, spinning him around before he collapsed among the scattered remains of their cook fire. 3 down, 3 to go, but the survivors were adapting to Kane's tactics with deadly efficiency. Billy Brennan had reloaded and was now firing controlled shots at suspected hiding places, his earlier hysteria replaced by focused malice. Miguel Santos had managed to reach cover despite his wounded shoulder and was returning fire with grim determination. Jim Sullivan had disappeared entirely, working his way through the rocks like a ghost. Eleanor crawled toward Tommy, her ears ringing from the gunshot and her vision blurred by the blood streaming from her split lip. The boy saw her coming and tried to speak, but the words were lost in the thunderous echo of weapons fire. "It's going to be all right, sweetheart," she whispered, working frantically at the knots holding him captive. "Mama's here." Tommy's eyes were huge with shock and fear, but he didn't cry. Even at 7 years old, he seemed to understand that tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. Eleanor felt a fierce pride in his courage, even as her fingers struggled. With the rope, Kane had moved again, his 4th shot coming from an entirely new position. This bullet found Miguel Santos's forehead, ending the tracker's participation in the fight with brutal finality. 4 down, and the odds were finally beginning to favor the hunter. But Silas Brennan had been using the chaos to position himself for his own killing shot. The gang leader had worked his way behind a large boulder that offered a clear view of Kane's likely hiding places, and his rifle was trained on a patch of shadow where movement had been detected. "I see you, you bastard," Brennan muttered, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot exploded across the canyon, followed immediately by a cry of pain from the darkness. Kane's return fire was noticeably delayed, and when it came, the aim was off by several feet. Brennan smiled with cold satisfaction. He'd hit his target. Jim Sullivan chose that moment to make his move, rising from concealment with both pistols blazing. He'd worked himself into position behind Kane's suspected location, and his coordinated assault with Brennan caught the gunslinger in a deadly crossfire. Kane rolled desperately between the rocks, crimson staining his left sleeve where Brennan's bullet had found its mark. His legendary speed was compromised by the wound, and Sullivan was pressing his advantage with murderous intent. Eleanor finally got the last knot loose and pulled Tommy against her chest, feeling his small body trembling with exhaustion and terror. They were free of their immediate bonds, but still trapped in the middle of a gunfight between professional killers. "Can you run, baby?" she whispered urgently. Tommy nodded, his young face set with determination that broke Eleanor's heart. Together, they began crawling toward the boulder Cain had indicated, seeking whatever protection the stone might offer. Billy Brennan saw them moving and swung his rifle toward the fleeing figures. His shot went wide, chipping stone near Eleanor's head, but the second shot would be better aimed. He was already working the lever action, bringing fresh ammunition into the chamber. That's when Cain appeared behind him like an avenging spirit. The wounded gunslinger had used Sullivan's assault to mask his own movement, circling through the rocks while the outlaw focused on his previous position. Cain's Colt Peacemaker pressed against the base of Billy's skull with the cold certainty of Judgment Day. "Drop it," Cain said quietly. Billy Brennan was 19 years old and had never learned the wisdom of surrender. Instead of dropping his rifle, he spun toward Cain with desperate speed. Trying to bring the weapon to bear on his tormentor, Cain's shot removed the top of Billy's head, painting the canyon wall behind him with blood and brain matter. The young killer's body crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering away into the darkness. Jim Sullivan heard his ally's death and turned to engage this new threat, but Cain was already moving. The gunslinger's wounded left arm hung useless at his side, but his right hand held steady as he put 2 bullets into Sullivan's chest. The outlaw staggered backward, his own shots going wild, then sat down heavily against a boulder and died. With his eyes open, sudden silence fell over the camp like a physical weight. The echoes of gunfire faded gradually, replaced by the whisper of wind through stone and the crackle of scattered embers from the ruined fire. Eleanor held Tommy against her chest and waited for her heart to stop hammering. Silas Brennan emerged from his hiding place with his hands raised, his rifle lying forgotten among the rocks. He was the only survivor of his gang, surrounded by the bodies of men who'd followed him into hell. But even in defeat, his pale eyes held no trace of surrender. "Impressive work, Cain," he said conversationally. "Though I notice you're bleeding quite freely. That arm is going to hold out much longer?" Cain kept his weapon trained on Brennan's chest. His own breathing labored from blood loss and exertion. The wound in his left arm was serious, and his face had taken on the waxy pallor that suggested significant trauma. "Long enough," Cain replied. Brennan smiled that cold smile one last time. "I don't think so. You see, you made one critical error in your little rescue operation." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. "What error?" Brennan's hand moved with blinding speed toward a hideout gun concealed in his boot, but Cain was faster. The Peacemaker roared once more, and Silas Brennan's criminal career ended in a spray of blood across the canyon floor. The gang leader's body fell backward, his unfired weapon spinning away into the darkness. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Tommy began to cry, soft sobs of relief and exhaustion that seemed to echo through the stone amphitheater. Eleanor held her son while Cain slumped against a boulder, his wounded arm cradled against his chest. Blood loss was taking its toll, and his pale face had taken on an alarming gray tinge. "Is it over?" Tommy whispered. Eleanor looked around at the carnage surrounding them. 6 dead outlaws scattered among the rocks like broken dolls. Their weapons silent and their threats finally ended. The nightmare that had begun 4 days ago in Millbrook Junction was finished at last. Double quotes. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's over." Cain struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as he surveyed the battlefield. "We need to move," he said thickly. "Gunfire carries in these canyons could draw attention we don't want." Eleanor helped him examine his wounded arm by the light of the scattered fire. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone, but he was losing blood at an alarming rate. She tore strips from her petticoat to create a makeshift bandage, working with the competence of a woman who'd learned frontier medicine by necessity. "Will you be able to ride?" she asked. Cain nodded, though the movement seemed to cost him considerable effort. "I've ridden with worse. We'll make it back to Tombstone if we start now." They gathered what supplies they could use from the outlaws' camp, including weapons and ammunition that might prove necessary during the journey home. Eleanor found her son's small jacket among Brennan's possessions and helped Tommy put it on, trying not to think about why the gang leader might have kept such a trophy. As they prepared to leave the scene of slaughter, Tommy tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. "Mama, who's that man?" he asked, looking at Kane with the solemn curiosity of childhood. Eleanor looked at the wounded gunslinger, this broken man who'd risked everything to bring her son home safely. Kane had become a killer to fight. Killers had embraced darkness to preserve light, and had paid a price that showed in every line of his haunted face. "He's someone who helps people who can't help themselves," she said finally. Kane's pale eyes met hers across the dying firelight, and for just a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something almost like peace in their depths. Perhaps the debt he'd carried for 2 years had finally been paid in full. The 3 survivors of the Devil's Playground began their slow climb out of Skeleton Canyon, leaving behind the bodies of 6 men who would never again threaten innocent people. Behind them, the desert wind began to scatter the ashes of their fire, gradually erasing all evidence that evil had ever made its home in that desolate place. Tommy Caldwell was going home. The journey back through Skeleton Canyon proved more treacherous than their descent into its depths. Kane's wound had weakened him considerably, and the blood loss made him dizzy in the saddle, despite Eleanor's makeshift bandaging. Tommy rode double with his mother, his small arms wrapped around her waist as they navigated the narrow trail by moonlight. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats now that Eleanor understood how quickly violence could erupt from apparent emptiness. The canyon walls that had felt oppressive before now seemed almost protective, shielding them from whatever other dangers might roam the Arizona wilderness. But she knew that feeling was an illusion. They were still hundreds of miles from anything resembling safety. Kane had insisted on taking point despite his condition, his pale eyes scanning the path ahead with professional vigilance. Even wounded and exhausted, he remained the most dangerous thing in these mountains, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the casual way he wore that deadly competence. "How far is the water?" she asked during one of their brief rests. Kane consulted a mental map built from years of hard travel across unforgiving country. "There's a spring about 6 miles north of here. We can water the horses and refill our canteens, maybe catch a few hours sleep if the area's secure." Tommy had been unusually quiet throughout the night ride, processing experiences no 7-year-old should ever have to endure. Eleanor could feel the tremors that occasionally ran through his small body, aftershocks of terror that would probably haunt his dreams for years to come. "Mama," he whispered as they rode through a particularly narrow section of trail, "are the bad men really dead?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. In all her planning and desperate scheming to rescue her son, she'd never considered how to explain the violence he'd witnessed. How did you tell a child that sometimes good people had to become killers to protect what mattered most? "Yes, sweetheart," she said finally. "They can't hurt anyone anymore. Mr. Kane killed them." Eleanor glanced toward the wounded gunslinger, riding ahead of them. "Mr. Kane stopped them from hurting other children the way they hurt you." Tommy considered this for a long moment. Was Papa ever like Mr. Kane? The innocence of the question nearly broke Eleanor's heart. Robert Caldwell had been a gentle soul who'd never raised his voice in anger, let alone taken a human life. He would have been horrified by the violence that had secured his son's freedom. Yet Eleanor felt no guilt about the choices she'd made. "No, baby," she said softly. "Papa was a different kind of good man. But sometimes the world needs Mr. Kane's kind of goodness too." They reached the spring just as dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The water bubbled up from deep rocks into a natural basin surrounded by hardy desert vegetation, creating a small oasis in the harsh landscape. Kane checked the area carefully before allowing them to dismount, his wounded arm hanging stiffly. At his side, Eleanor helped Tommy drink from the clear water while Kane tended to their horses with methodical attention to detail. Even injured and exhausted, he understood that their lives depended on keeping the animals healthy and strong. A lame horse in this country was often a death sentence. "We'll rest here for 2 hours," Kane announced, settling himself against a large boulder where he could watch the approaches to their camp. "Then we push hard for Wilcox. There's a doctor there who won't ask uncomfortable questions about gunshot wounds." Eleanor examined Kane's bandages and found them soaked through with fresh blood. The wound was worse than he'd admitted, and she could see fever beginning to burn in his pale eyes. He needed proper medical attention soon, or the bullet that had missed his vital organs might still kill him through infection and blood loss. "You should let me redress that wound," she said. Kane shook his head stubbornly. "It'll hold until we reach Wilcox, and if it doesn't, what happens to Tommy and me if you collapse from blood loss in the middle of nowhere?" The practical question penetrated Kane's stoic facade. He reluctantly allowed Eleanor to examine the wound properly, revealing damage worse than she'd feared. The bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, leaving a ragged channel that continued to seep despite her earlier efforts. At BNDAGING. Eleanor cleaned the wound as best she could with their limited supplies, using whiskey from Kane's personal flask to disinfect the torn flesh. Kane endured the procedure in stoic silence, but she could see the pain in the tight lines around his eyes. "You saved my son's life," she said quietly as she worked. "Why?" Kane was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. "When?" He finally spoke. His voice carried a weight of old grief that made her chest ache in sympathy. "I had a boy once," he said. "Not mine by blood, but close enough. Jake Morrison's nephew came to live with us after his parents died in a house fire. 8 years old, bright as a new penny, full of questions about everything under the sun." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bandage. She could hear the pain in Kane's voice, old wounds that had never properly healed. "What happened to him?" Kane's pale eyes stared into the distance, seeing ghosts from a past he couldn't change. Billy Morrison was visiting Jake and his wife in Fort Smith when the Comancheros hit the town. They took him along with 6 other children, planning to sell them to slavers in Mexico. Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Did you find him?" "We tracked them for 3 weeks across Indian Territory," King continued, his voice growing flatter with each word. "Jake and I following the trail that grew colder every day. When we finally caught up to them, Billy had been dead for a week, killed when he tried to escape." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of old grief and new understanding. Eleanor finished tying off the fresh bandage and sat back on her heels, looking at this broken man who'd saved her son because he couldn't save another child years ago. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. Kane shrugged, the movement causing him to wince. "Jake never got over it. Started drinking, stopped caring about the job. 6 months later, he was dead in a Colorado canyon because he hesitated when he should have acted, and I became something else entirely." Tommy had fallen asleep against a sun-warmed rock, exhausted by the night's ordeal. Eleanor watched him sleep and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her chest. This man had risked everything to bring her son home safely, driven by memories of a child he couldn't save. "What will you do now?" she asked. Kane checked his weapon and scanned the surrounding landscape with professional attention. "Brennan's gang is finished, but there are always others. Men who prey on the innocent, who take what doesn't belong to them. Someone has to stop them." Eleanor heard the resignation in his voice, the acceptance of a path that led only to violence and eventual death. "Is that the only choice you have?" Kane looked at her with those pale, empty eyes. "It's the only choice I'm good at." They rested through the heat of midday, taking shelter from the brutal sun that could kill as efficiently as any bullet. Kane dozed fitfully against his boulder, his face gray with pain and blood loss. Eleanor kept watch, her derringer reloaded and ready despite having only one shot remaining. Tommy woke with the afternoon shadows, his young face marked by dreams that made him whimper in his sleep. Eleanor held him close and murmured reassurances, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. They were still days from home, traveling through a country where death waited around every bend. Kane roused himself as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. His condition had worsened during their rest, and Eleanor could see fever burning behind his eyes. But he climbed into his saddle with grim determination, leading them back onto the trail toward civilization. The second day of their journey brought them out of the mountains and into the rolling hills that marked the approach to Wilcox. Kane swayed occasionally in his saddle, fighting to remain conscious as infection began to claim its toll. Eleanor rode close beside him, ready to catch him if he fell. "There," Kane said thickly, pointing toward a cluster of buildings visible in the distance. "Wilcox. Doc Stevens will patch me up, and you can send word to Millbrook Junction that you're safe." Eleanor felt tears of relief prick her eyes at the sight of the town. They'd made it. Against all odds, through violence and bloodshed and the kind of country that swallowed travelers without a trace. They'd brought Tommy home. Doc Stevens proved to be a gruff man in his 60s who asked no questions about how Kane had acquired his wounds. He cleaned and stitched the bullet hole with practiced efficiency, muttering about damn fool gunfighters who thought they were invincible. Kane endured the treatment in stoic silence, though Eleanor could see the relief in his face. When the bleeding finally stopped, "You'll live," Stevens announced, "but that arm needs rest. No more gunfighting for at least a month, or you'll tear those stitches out and bleed to death in some godforsaken canyon." Kane nodded his understanding, but Eleanor could see he had no intention of following the doctor's advice. Men like Marcus Kane didn't retire from their chosen profession. They died in it. The hotel in Wilcox provided the first real beds Eleanor and Tommy had seen in nearly a week. They slept for 14 hours straight, dead to the world as their bodies recovered from the ordeal they'd endured. When Eleanor finally woke, she found Kane sitting in a chair by the window, fully dressed and ready to travel. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Kane nodded. "Got word about some cattle rustlers operating down near the border. The ranchers are willing to pay good money to see them stopped." Eleanor felt an unexpected sadness at his departure. This broken, dangerous man had risked everything to save her son, and now he was simply going to disappear back into the violent world that had shaped him. "Will we ever see you again?" Kane's smile was tired but genuine. "I hope not, Mrs. Caldwell. If you see me again, it means trouble has found you, and you've had enough trouble for one lifetime." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Take care of that boy. He's got courage in him. Make sure he learns when to use it and when to walk away." Eleanor watched from the window as Kane mounted his black stallion and rode out of Wilcox, disappearing into the heat shimmer that rose from the desert floor. Within moments, he was gone as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only memories of pale eyes and deadly competence. 2 days later, Eleanor and Tommy boarded the stage for Millbrook Junction, beginning the final leg of their journey home. Tommy sat pressed against his mother's side, still quiet, but no longer trembling with fear. The ordeal had marked him, would probably always mark him, but he'd survived with his essential goodness intact. As the stage rolled north through a familiar country, Eleanor thought about the choices she'd made and the prices that had been paid. 6 men were dead because she'd hired a killer to save her son. The law would probably call it murder, but Eleanor called it justice. Millbrook Junction appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its simple buildings and dusty streets representing everything she'd almost lost. The townspeople gathered as the stage pulled up, their faces showing relief and curiosity in equal measure. Sheriff Morrison helped them down from the coach, his questions dying on his lips when he saw the change in Eleanor's eyes. Mrs. Henderson fussed over Tommy while Dr. Pritchard examined him for injuries. The boy was physically unharmed, but quieter than before, marked by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. Eleanor knew it would take time for him to fully heal, but children were resilient creatures. He would recover. That evening, as Eleanor tucked Tommy into his own bed for the first time in over a week, he looked up at her with solemn eyes. "Mama, will the bad dreams go away?" Eleanor smoothed his hair with gentle fingers. "Eventually, sweetheart. But even if they don't, we'll face them together." Tommy nodded and closed his eyes, trusting in his mother's promise. Eleanor sat with him until he fell asleep, then walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful streets of her small town. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Marcus Kane was hunting new monsters, carrying his burden of violence through a world that created more evil than one man could ever eliminate. Eleanor said a quiet prayer for his safety, though she knew prayers probably bounced off a man like Kane without leaving a mark. She'd gotten her son back, but the cost would haunt her dreams for years to come. 6 men had died, and while she felt no guilt for their deaths, she understood now that some victories could only be purchased with pieces of your soul. The price had been worth paying. Eleanor Caldwell closed the curtains, checked the locks on her doors, and went to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring the slow work of rebuilding their lives. The nightmare was over, but its echoes would linger in Millbrook Junction long after the last witness to the violence had been laid to rest. Outside, the desert wind carried stories of gunfighters and outlaws across the endless miles, adding new legends to the mythology of the American frontier. And in a small town that most maps forgot to mention, a mother and son began the long process of learning to live with what they'd survived. The broken gunslinger rode on through the darkness, carrying his deadly burden toward whatever hell awaited him next. 2 weeks after returning to Millbrook Junction, Eleanor Caldwell discovered that surviving hell didn't mean escaping its consequences. The town that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed fragile as spun glass, and every stranger who rode down Main Street carried the potential for renewed violence. She'd learned that innocence, once shattered, could never be fully restored. Tommy's recovery proved more complex than she'd anticipated. During the day, he seemed almost normal, helping in the store, playing with the wooden soldiers his father had carved years before, asking endless questions about everything except their recent ordeal. But night brought different realities. He'd wake screaming from dreams filled with pale eyes and gleaming knives, reaching for his mother with desperate hands that remembered being bound with rope. Dr. Pritchard had examined Tommy thoroughly upon their return, pronouncing him physically unharmed, but recommending patience for what he delicately termed nervous exhaustion. The physician's kind eyes couldn't quite hide his curiosity about exactly what had transpired during their absence, but Eleanor offered no details beyond the necessary facts. Some stories were too dark for respectable conversation. The townspeople's reactions varied considerably. Most treated Eleanor with newfound respect tinged by wariness, as if her survival of such an ordeal had marked her as something slightly apart from ordinary folk. Mrs. Henderson still stopped by daily with offers of help and gossip, but her chatter now carried an undercurrent of fascination with violence that made Eleanor uncomfortable. Even kindness could become contaminated by proximity to bloodshed. Sheriff Morrison had asked surprisingly few questions about the specifics of Tommy's rescue. Eleanor suspected he preferred not knowing details that might require official action or uncomfortable reports to territorial authorities. The sheriff was a pragmatic man who understood that some problems were better solved outside the boundaries of conventional law, but not everyone in Millbrook Junction was content to let sleeping diamonds lie undisturbed. Eleanor first noticed the stranger on a Tuesday morning in early October. He sat his horse at the far end of Main Street, studying the town with the patient attention of a man taking inventory. Even at a distance, something about his posture suggested professional competence. Of the dangerous variety. He wore travel-stained clothes and carried his weapons with the casual familiarity Eleanor had learned to recognize in men whose lives depended on violence. The stranger made no attempt to approach or engage with anyone. He simply watched, taking careful note of routines and vulnerabilities with the methodical attention of a predator studying its prey. After an hour of silent observation, he turned his horse south and disappeared beyond the hills, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of unease. Eleanor mentioned the incident to Sheriff Morrison during his evening rounds, but the lawman seemed more concerned with avoiding responsibility than investigating potential threats. His advice consisted primarily of keeping doors locked and weapons close, wisdom that Eleanor had already embraced during sleepless nights filled with phantom sounds and imagined dangers. The second sighting came 3 days later. This time, the stranger approached close enough for Eleanor to see his face clearly through the store window. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held the flat emptiness she'd learned to associate with professional killers. He wore a deputy marshal's badge, but Eleanor had grown skeptical of such symbols since learning how easily they could be counterfeited or corrupted. The man didn't enter the store, but his interest was clearly focused on the building and its occupants. He spent several minutes studying the layout, noting entrances and sight lines with the thoroughness of someone planning future action. When Tommy appeared in the window beside his mother, the stranger's attention sharpened noticeably. Eleanor pulled her son away from the glass and retreated deeper into the store, her heart hammering with familiar dread. The nightmare she'd thought was finished might be preparing for a second act. That evening, she wrote a letter she hoped would never need to be sent. The message was brief and coded in language that would be meaningless to casual readers, but clear enough for its intended recipient. She addressed it to Marcus Kane, care of the Cattleman's Hotel in Tucson, and gave it to the next mail rider heading south. If Kane was still alive, if he was still in Arizona territory, if he remembered his promise to respond when called, then perhaps Eleanor and Tommy might survive whatever storm was gathering on the horizon. But those were significant assumptions, and Eleanor had learned not to rely on hope when preparing for violence. The third encounter proved that her caution was justified. Eleanor was closing the store on Friday evening when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple riders approaching from the north. Through the window, she could see 4 men on horseback moving down Main Street with the deliberate pace of a military patrol. They rode in formation, their weapons visible and ready, their attention focused on her building with unmistakable intent. The leader was the dark-haired stranger she'd seen twice before, but now his badge caught the lamplight with official authority. Behind him rode 3 companions whose faces showed the hard competence of men accustomed to enforcing their will through violence. These weren't random drifters or opportunistic bandits. They were organized, professional, and dangerous. Eleanor quickly extinguished the store's lamps and gathered Tommy from the back room where he'd been playing. The boys sensed the urgency in her movements and asked no questions, following her toward the rear exit they'd identified as their primary escape route. But as they approached the back door, Eleanor heard the creak of leather and the soft jingle of spurs from the alley behind the building. They were surrounded. The front door of the store opened with a deliberate squeal of hinges, and the dark-haired leader stepped inside with his weapon drawn. His 3 companions remained outside, positioned to prevent any escape attempts while their leader conducted whatever business had brought them to Millbrook Junction. "Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell," the man said, his voice carrying the flat authority of official law enforcement. "I'm Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson, and I have some questions about your recent activities." Eleanor kept Tommy behind her as she faced the intruder, her hand resting on the grip of the pistol Kane had insisted she carry. The weapon felt heavy and foreign against her palm, but she'd practiced with it during the long nights since their return forcing herself to become familiar with its deadly potential. What kind of questions? Dawson holstered his weapon in a gesture of apparent reasonableness, but his eyes remained alert for any sign of resistance. Questions about Marcus Kane and his involvement in the deaths of 6 men in Skeleton Canyon. You were present during that incident, according to my information. Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. If federal authorities were investigating Kane's activities, it meant the violence that had saved her son might now destroy them both. Aiding a vigilante could result in serious criminal charges, and Tommy could end up in territorial custody, while she faced trial and possible execution. I don't know what you're talking about, she said carefully. Dawson smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Mrs. Caldwell, I have witness statements placing you and your son in Kane's company during the period when Silas Brennan's gang was eliminated. I also have physical evidence linking Kane to the crime scene. Denying involvement will only make things more difficult for everyone. Tommy pressed closer against Eleanor's back, his small hands clutching her skirt with the desperate grip of a child who'd learned to fear strange men in positions of authority. Eleanor could feel his trembling through the fabric and fought to keep her own voice steady. Even if what you're saying is true, I fail to see how rescuing a kidnapped child constitutes a crime. The crime isn't the rescue, Mrs. Caldwell. The crime is the method used to accomplish it. 6 men were executed without trial, without due process, without any legal authority whatsoever. That's murder in the eyes of federal law, regardless of the victim's previous actions. Eleanor stared at the deputy marshal with growing disbelief. Those men kidnapped my son. They threatened to kill him if anyone attempted rescue. They were outlaws and murderers who'd terrorized this territory for years. And they should have been arrested and tried in a proper court of law, Dawson replied. Kane took it upon himself to act as judge, jury, and executioner. That makes him a criminal, and anyone who aided him an accessory to murder. The moral blindness of this statement left Eleanor speechless. This man was more concerned with legal procedures than with justice, more interested in protecting the rights of dead killers than in acknowledging the reality of frontier survival. She began to understand why Kane had chosen to operate outside the boundaries of conventional law. What do you want from me? Dawson's expression grew more calculating. Information about Kane's current whereabouts and his future plans. Names of other individuals who might have aided his vigilante activities. Details about his methods and associates. In exchange, I might be willing to overlook your involvement in the Skeleton Canyon incident. Eleanor heard the threat beneath the reasonable words. Cooperate or face prosecution for helping to save her own child. The federal law this man represented was as corrupt and dangerous as the outlaws it claimed to pursue. And if I refuse to provide this information? Dawson's smile widened, revealing teeth like broken glass. Then you and your son will be arrested as accessories to murder and held pending trial in Tucson. Territorial jails can be unpleasant places for women and children. Accidents happen with disturbing frequency. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Eleanor realized she was facing another predator, one who used legal authority instead of outright violence, but whose intentions were equally malicious. Tommy would be used as leverage to force her compliance, just as he'd been used by Silas Brennan. That's when Eleanor Caldwell made a decision that surprised even herself. Get out of my store, she said quietly. Dawson raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry? I said get out. You have no legal authority to interrogate me without formal charges, and you've made no attempt to present a warrant or other judicial authorization. You're nothing but a bully with a badge trying to intimidate a woman and child. The deputy. Marshall's facade of reasonableness cracked, revealing something much uglier beneath. His hand drifted toward his weapon as his pale eyes hardened with genuine menace. You're making a serious mistake, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm offering you a chance to cooperate voluntarily. If you force me to use other methods, you won't like the results." Eleanor's hand closed around the grip of her concealed pistol. The weight felt more familiar now, more natural, as if the violence she'd witnessed had awakened something sleeping in her soul. "The only mistake I made was trusting that badge to mean something honorable. Now get out before I decide to test whether federal marshals bleed the same color as ordinary criminals." Dawson stared at her for a long moment, clearly surprised by the steel in her voice. When he finally spoke, his words carried the promise of future violence. "This isn't over, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll be back with proper documentation and sufficient force to ensure your cooperation. When that happens, I suggest you remember that accidents can befall anyone who interferes with federal investigations." He turned and walked toward the door, pausing on the threshold to deliver one final threat. "Keep the boy close. In my experience, children who get separated from their mothers in this territory tend to disappear permanently." After Dawson and his men rode away, Eleanor barricaded the store and checked every window and door twice. Tommy helped without complaint, understanding instinctively that their safety depended on vigilance and preparation. They'd survived one nightmare only to find themselves facing another, but this time Eleanor was determined to be ready. She'd learned important lessons in Skeleton Canyon about the nature of evil and the price of survival. Some men couldn't be reasoned with or appealed to. They could only be stopped through superior violence applied with ruthless efficiency. If Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson wanted to threaten her family, he would discover that Eleanor Caldwell was no longer the helpless victim he imagined her to be. The letter to Marcus Kane took on new urgency as Eleanor sealed it with wax and her late husband's signet ring. If the broken gunslinger was still alive somewhere in the vast wilderness of Arizona territory, she would need his deadly skills once more. The law had failed her again, leaving only violence as a viable solution to the threats gathering like storm clouds on her horizon. Outside, the desert wind carried whispers of approaching danger across the empty miles between Millbrook Junction and whatever hell was preparing to descend upon them. Eleanor held her son close and waited for the storm to break, knowing that this time she would meet it with weapons in her hands and steel in her heart. The ghosts of the past were stirring, and they would demand blood before they could be laid to rest. 3 months after the bloodbath in Skeleton Canyon, the nightmare still came to Tommy Caldwell with the regularity of desert storms. He would wake in the small hours before dawn, his young face damp with sweat and his mother's name on his lips. Eleanor had grown accustomed to these midnight vigils, holding her son until the tremors passed and morning light banished the demons that lived in darkness, but tonight was different. Tonight, Tommy sat bolt upright in bed with eyes wide and alert, listening to something only he could hear. "Mama," he whispered. "Someone's coming." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. The instincts Kane had awakened in her during their violent journey were never far from the surface now, and Tommy's words triggered every alarm her mind possessed. She reached for the loaded shotgun she kept beside her bed, a weapon that would have been unthinkable in her home before Silas Brennan had taught her the true nature of the world. "How many?" she asked, moving to the window with practiced stealth. Tommy closed his eyes and tilted his head, using senses sharpened by trauma to read the night. 3 horses, maybe 4. They're trying to be quiet." Eleanor peered through the gap in her curtains and saw shadows moving between the buildings across Main Street. Professional movements, careful and coordinated like the Brennan gang had been. Her chest tightened with familiar dread. Word of Brennan's death had spread across the territory with the speed that violent news always traveled. Most decent people had celebrated the end of his reign of terror, but Eleanor had learned that every predator had allies, friends, and family members who might seek vengeance for his killing. She'd been expecting this visit for weeks. "Get dressed quickly and quietly," she told Tommy. "Remember what we practiced." They'd rehearsed the scenario dozens of times since returning to Millbrook Junction. Tommy knew to gather the emergency supplies hidden in his closet, knew the escape route through the back window, knew where to hide in the desert if everything went wrong. Eleanor had sworn she would never again be caught unprepared for violence. A soft knock came at the front door of the store. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. The pattern was almost polite, like a neighbor calling for a social visit. But neighbors didn't come calling at 3 in the morning, and politeness could mask the most dangerous intentions. Eleanor moved through her store with the shotgun ready, stepping carefully around the floorboards she knew would creak. Through the glass, she could see a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. The man's stance was familiar, and for a moment her heart leaped with hope. But this wasn't Marcus Kane. "Mrs. Caldwell," a voice called softly through the door. "My name is Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson. I need to speak with you about the events in Skeleton Canyon." Eleanor's grip tightened on the shotgun. Federal marshals didn't usually travel at night, and they certainly didn't approach civilian homes without local law enforcement. This felt like a trap. "Show me your badge," she called back. The man held up a metal star that gleamed in the moonlight. But Eleanor had learned not to trust appearances. Badges could be stolen, forged, or simply worn by men who'd bought them from corrupt officials. "What do you want?" "Information about Marcus Kane and his activities," Dawson replied. "I'm investigating charges of murder and vigilantism. I understand you were present during the incident." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. If Kane was being hunted by federal authorities, it meant the law had finally decided to pursue him for the violence that defined his existence. But it also meant that anyone who'd aided him could face charges as an accessory. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Deputy Marshal Dawson chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Mrs. Caldwell, 6 men died in that canyon. Their bodies were found by prospectors 2 weeks ago, along with evidence linking Marcus Kane to their deaths. You and your son were seen leaving Skeleton Canyon in Kane's company." Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities and dangers. Even if this man was legitimate law enforcement, his arrival at night suggested urgency that went beyond normal legal procedures. And if he wasn't legitimate, then she and Tommy were facing another group of predators, drawn by the scent of vulnerability. "I want to see Sheriff Morrison," she said. "We can discuss this matter in his office during normal business hours." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Dawson replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Sheriff Morrison suffered an unfortunate accident earlier this evening. Fell down the stairs outside his office and broke his neck. Tragic loss for your community." Eleanor felt her world tilt sideways. Morrison might have been ineffectual and cowardly, but he was also honest and decent. His death so soon after this stranger's arrival couldn't be coincidence. "However," Dawson continued, "I'm willing to overlook your involvement in Kane's vigilante activities in exchange for information about his current whereabouts. A mutually beneficial arrangement." Through the back window, Eleanor could see Tommy moving carefully through the shadows toward their predetermined rendezvous point. Her son had inherited more than just his father's steady nerves. He'd also developed survival instincts that served him well in this dangerous new world they inhabited. "I told you, I don't know anything about Marcus Kane's activities. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm trying to be reasonable here. But my patience has limits, and frankly, a woman alone with a small child is in a very vulnerable position. Accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with federal investigations." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Eleanor realized this conversation had moved far beyond law enforcement into something much darker. Whether Dawson was a corrupt marshal or simply a criminal wearing a stolen badge, his intentions toward her and Tommy were becoming obvious. She made her decision. The shotgun blast shattered the store's front window and sent Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson diving for cover behind a water trough. Eleanor didn't wait to see if she'd hit him. She was already moving toward the back of the store. Grabbing the emergency supplies she'd prepared for exactly this situation, shouts erupted from the street as Dawson's companions reacted to the gunfire. Eleanor heard boots running on wooden sidewalks and the metallic click of weapons being readied. At least 3 men, possibly more, all converging on her location with deadly intent. She slipped out the back window and into the alley. Behind her store, moving through familiar darkness toward the spot where Tommy waited. The boy emerged from his hiding place with admirable calm, carrying the small pack of supplies they'd prepared for emergencies. "This way," Eleanor whispered, leading him toward the livery stable where their horses were kept. But their path was blocked by a figure that materialized from the shadows like a nightmare-given form. The man was tall and lean, with pale eyes that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of Silas Brennan. His badge gleamed in the moonlight, but his smile held the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with law enforcement. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Caldwell?" Eleanor raised her shotgun, but the man was faster. His pistol appeared in his hand with practiced speed, the barrel aimed directly at Tommy's head. "I wouldn't if I were you," he said conversationally. "Boys are such fragile creatures. One wrong move, and poor Tommy here might suffer another tragic accident." Eleanor felt rage and helplessness war in her chest. Once again, her son was being used as leverage by men who measured human life in terms of convenience and profit. The shotgun trembled in her hands as she fought the urge to risk everything on a desperate shot. "What do you want?" "Same thing Marshal Dawson wants," the man replied. "Information about Marcus Kane. Where he is, where he's going, who he's working for. Simple questions with simple answers." "And if I don't know the answers?" The man's smile widened, revealing teeth like broken glass. "Then we'll have to find creative ways to help you remember." That's when the desert night erupted in gunfire for the second time in 3 months, and Marcus Kane announced his return to Millbrook Junction. The shot came from the roof of McGrath's saloon, a distance of nearly 200 yards in uncertain light. But Kane's bullet found its target with surgical precision, taking the gunman holding Tommy hostage through the center of his forehead. The man dropped without a sound, his unfired weapon clattering on the wooden sidewalk. Eleanor grabbed Tommy and dove behind a pile of feed sacks as answering shots began to fly from multiple directions. Kane had returned, but he was facing at least 3 armed opponents in an urban environment where civilian casualties were a constant danger. "Stay down and don't move," Eleanor told Tommy, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Kane's second shot dropped another of Dawson's men as the gunman tried to flank his position. The bullet caught the outlaw in the chest and spun him around before he collapsed among the scattered debris of a broken wagon. Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson had taken cover behind the water trough and was returning fire with methodical precision. His shots chipped wood and shattered glass as he tried to pin down Kane's position, but the gunslinger had already moved to a new location. "Kane," Dawson shouted across the distance, "this is federal business. You're interfering with a legitimate investigation." Kane's answer came in the form of a third shot that sent splinters flying from the edge of Dawson's cover. The message was clear, legitimate or not. Kane didn't care about the man's claimed authority. Eleanor could see the tactical situation developing with the clarity born of recent violent experience. Kane had the high ground and superior marksmanship, but he was outnumbered and surrounded. The surviving members of Dawson's group were moving to encircle his position, using the buildings for cover as they closed the distance. One of them was working his way around behind the saloon, carrying a rifle and moving with the practiced stealth of a professional killer. Kane couldn't see this flanking movement from his current position, and Eleanor realized the gunslinger was about to walk into a trap. She made a decision that would have been impossible 3 months ago. Eleanor left Tommy hidden behind the feed sacks and worked her way through the shadows toward the man stalking Kane. The shotgun felt heavy in her hands, but she'd learned to carry that weight during the long nights since. Skeleton Canyon. The assassin was so focused on his target that he never noticed the woman creeping up behind him. Eleanor pressed the shotgun's barrel against the base of his skull and pulled both triggers simultaneously. The blast echoed through the alley like thunder, and the would-be killer's head simply disappeared in a spray of blood and bone fragments. Eleanor stood over his body for a moment, surprised by how little the violence affected her now. She'd crossed a line in Skeleton Canyon that could never be uncrossed. Kane's next shot finally found Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson, catching the corrupt lawman as he tried to rush the saloon's rear entrance. Dawson staggered backward with a crimson flower blooming across his chest, his badge catching the moonlight one last time before he collapsed beside the water trough that had failed to protect him. Silence fell over Millbrook Junction like a burial shroud. 4 more men were dead, their blood mixing with the dust of Main Street, while the survivors tried to process what had just happened. Eleanor walked back to where Tommy waited, her shotgun empty, but her resolve intact. Kane climbed down from his perch with careful attention to the shadows, his pale eyes scanning for additional threats. He looked older than Eleanor remembered, marked by whatever violence he'd encountered during his months on the trail. But he was alive, and he'd come back to protect them when they needed him most. "How did you know?" Eleanor asked. Kane reloaded his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Word travels fast in my line of work. When I heard that federal marshals were asking questions about Skeleton Canyon, I figured they'd come for you eventually." "Were they really marshals?" Kane knelt beside Dawson's body and examined the dead man's badge with professional interest. "Frank Dawson was a real deputy marshal," he said finally. "But he went bad about 2 years ago. Started selling information to outlaws and taking money to look the other way. The other 3 were just hired killers wearing stolen badges." Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of her had hoped they were dealing with simple criminals rather than corrupt law enforcement, but the distinction seemed meaningless now that they were all dead. "What happens now?" she asked. Kane stood and brushed dust from his clothes, his expression grim. "Now you and Tommy disappear, tonight. Dawson had friends in the Federal Marshal Service, and they'll come looking for answers when he doesn't report back. You can't be here when they arrive." Eleanor looked around at the town that had been her home for most of her adult life. The store where she'd built her modest prosperity, the streets where Tommy had learned to walk, the familiar faces of neighbors who'd become her extended family. All of it would have to be abandoned because she'd chosen to hire a killer to save her son. But as she watched Tommy emerge from his hiding place, unharmed and alive despite another night of violence, Eleanor knew she'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth any sacrifice. "Where do we go?" Kane was already walking toward the livery stable, his mind working through possibilities and dangers. "California. I know people in San Francisco who can help you start over with new names and new histories. It's not perfect, but it's better than staying here and waiting for the next group of killers to come calling." Eleanor took one last look at the life she was leaving behind, then followed Kane into the darkness. Behind them, Millbrook Junction settled back into silence, leaving only the dead to bear witness to the price of survival in a world where justice came at the end of a gun. The broken gunslinger, the determined mother, and the resilient child disappeared into the desert night, carrying their shared burden of violence toward whatever uncertain future awaited them beyond the horizon. Some debts, Eleanor had learned, could never be fully paid. They could only be carried forward into tomorrow, adding their weight to the choices that defined who you became in a world that offered no guarantees except the certainty of struggle. The reckoning's shadow followed them into the wasteland, patient and persistent as death itself. The wagon wheels kicked up clouds of alkali dust as Eleanor, Tommy, and Marcus Kane made their way across the Sonoran Desert toward California. 3 days had passed since the gunfight that ended Deputy Marshal Frank Dawson's corrupt career. And with each mile they put between themselves and Arizona territory, Eleanor felt the weight of their violent past growing lighter. Tommy rode beside her on the wagon seat, his young face turned toward the western horizon where purple mountains promised sanctuary beyond the reach of badges and vengeance. The boy had adapted to their nomadic existence with remarkable resilience, treating their flight as an adventure rather than an exile. Children possessed a gift for finding normalcy in the most abnormal circumstances. Kane rode point on his black stallion, his pale eyes constantly scanning the harsh landscape for potential threats. The gunslinger's wounds from Skeleton Canyon had healed cleanly, but Eleanor could see new lines of weariness etched into his face. Each violent encounter took something from him that could never be restored, and she wondered how much longer he could sustain the weight of his chosen profession. Their destination was San Francisco, where Kane claimed to know people who specialized in creating new identities for those needing to disappear from their former lives. Eleanor would become Margaret Sullivan, a widow from Oregon seeking a fresh start in California's booming economy. Tommy would be her nephew, orphaned by cholera and now under her care. Simple stories were easier to maintain than elaborate deceptions. The money from selling her store and possessions wouldn't last forever, but it would provide enough cushion to establish themselves in their new home. Eleanor planned to open another general store, perhaps in one of the growing communities around San Francisco Bay. It would be similar work in a different place, but that continuity appealed to her practical nature. Kane had grown increasingly quiet as they traveled west, speaking only when necessary and spending long hours studying their backtrail for signs of pursuit. Eleanor sensed he was wrestling with decisions that went beyond their immediate journey, internal battles between the man he'd been and the killer he'd become. On their fourth evening together, as they camped beside a seasonal creek that provided welcome relief from the desert's relentless heat, Kane finally voiced what had been troubling him. "I can't keep doing this," he said, staring into their small campfire as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Every time I think I've paid the debt for Jake's death, something else comes along that requires the same solution. It never ends." Eleanor poured coffee from their battered pot and handed him a tin cup. "What's the alternative?" Kane's laugh was bitter and empty. "I don't know. That's the problem. Violence is the only skill I have left, the only thing I'm good at. Take that away, and what's left?" Tommy looked up from the wooden horse he'd been carving with Kane's spare knife. The boy had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention children gave to discussions that might affect their future. "You could be a sheriff," Tommy suggested with innocent optimism. "Sheriffs help people too, and they don't have to hide from the law." Kane smiled at the child's simple logic, but Eleanor could see the pain behind his pale eyes. "Sheriffs have to follow rules, son. They have to arrest people and let judges decide what happens next. I'm not good at following rules anymore." "Then make your own rules," Eleanor said quietly. "Find a place where your skills are needed, but where you can use them to build something instead of just destroying things." Kane considered her words while the desert night settled around them like a familiar blanket. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices carrying ancient songs of survival and adaptation. Perhaps there was wisdom in their ability to thrive in harsh circumstances by changing their methods rather than their essential nature. "There's a town in Colorado," Kane said finally. "Silver Creek. The mine owners have been having trouble with claim jumpers and thieves, but it's too small to attract territorial law enforcement. They've been looking for someone to maintain order, someone who understands that sometimes justice requires more direct methods." Eleanor heard the possibility in his voice, the first hint of hope she detected since their reunion. "It sounds like a place where your particular talents might be appreciated. It's also far enough from Arizona that Dawson's friends would have trouble tracking us there," Kane added. "If you're interested in starting over somewhere that's not quite as civilized as San Francisco." Eleanor looked at Tommy, who was listening with the bright curiosity that characterized his approach to new experiences. The boy had endured more violence and upheaval in the past few months than most adults faced in a lifetime, yet he remained resilient and optimistic about their future. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked. "Would you like to see Colorado?" Tommy's face lit up with excitement. "Are there really silver mines? Can we see how they dig this silver out of the ground?" Kane's smile was genuine for the first time. "In days. I'm sure that could be arranged." They spent the rest of the evening planning their new life in Silver Creek, sharing stories and dreams around the flickering campfire. Eleanor found herself imagining a future where violence was a tool for protection rather than revenge, where Tommy could grow up in a community that valued Kane's skills without condemning his methods. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of 3 riders, approaching from the east. Kane's reaction was immediate and professional. Weapons drawn, positions taken, escape routes identified. But as the strangers drew closer, Eleanor recognized the lead rider as Dr. Pritchard from Millbrook Junction. The physician raised his hands to show he carried no weapons, calling out a greeting when he was still 50 yards away. With him rode Sheriff Morrison and a man Eleanor didn't recognize, all 3 looking exhausted from hard travel across difficult terrain. "Mrs. Caldwell," Dr. Pritchard called out. "Thank God we found you. We've been riding for 2 days trying to catch up." Kane kept his weapons ready, but allowed the men to approach within speaking distance. His pale eyes fixed on Sheriff Morrison with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential threats. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, her hand resting on her own pistol. Dr. Pritchard dismounted slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "To tell you that you can come home." Deputy Marshal Dawson's superiors arrived in Millbrook Junction yesterday morning. Seems the good deputy was wanted for murder and corruption in 3 different territories. His death has been ruled justified, and all charges against you and Mr. Kane have been dropped. Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and bitter irony. The law that had threatened to destroy them was now absolving them of crimes committed in self-defense. But the vindication came too late to undo the choices they'd already made. The territorial governor has officially commended Mr. Kane for his service in eliminating threats to public safety, the unknown rider added, introducing himself as Captain Williams of the Territorial Rangers. There's even talk of offering him a formal position in law enforcement. Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "The same law that wanted to hang me last week is now offering me a badge? That's rich." Captain Williams had the grace to look embarrassed. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Kane, but the territory needs men with your skills and experience. Good men who understand that sometimes the law has to be enforced with bullets rather than paperwork." Eleanor saw the temptation in Kane's face, the appeal of legitimacy and official sanction for the violence that defined his existence. But she also saw the weariness that ran deeper than physical exhaustion, the soul-deep fatigue of a man who'd been fighting other people's battles for too long. "Thank you for the offer," Kane said finally, "but I've got other plans." They spent an hour with the visitors, sharing coffee and exchanging news from the territory they'd left behind. Eleanor learned that Millbrook Junction was already beginning to recover from recent events, with new settlers arriving to replace those who'd fled during the violence. Life had a way of filling empty spaces, healing wounds, and moving forward. Despite the scars left by trauma. As the men from Arizona prepared to depart, Dr. Pritchard pulled Eleanor aside for a private conversation. "Are you sure about this decision?" he asked quietly. "Tommy needs stability, community, familiar faces. Running away might not be the best solution for either of you." Eleanor looked toward the western mountains where their new life waited. "Tommy needs to learn that sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do, that starting over isn't failure, it's hope." The physician nodded slowly, understanding in his kind eyes. "Then I wish you both the best of luck," And Mrs. Caldwell? Thank you for showing us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. After the visitors departed, Eleanor, Tommy, and Kane resumed their journey toward Colorado. And whatever future awaited them in Silver Creek, the wagon wheels found their rhythm again, carrying them across landscapes that grew more beautiful with each passing mile. Tommy chattered excitedly about silver mines and mountain adventures while Kane rode beside them with something approaching peace in his pale eyes. Eleanor felt the weight of their violent past settling into memory, becoming part of their story rather than the entirety of their destiny. They would reach Silver Creek in 10 days. According to Kane's calculations, there would be new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove that good people could triumph over evil. When they found the courage to fight for what mattered most, Eleanor Caldwell had learned many things during her journey, through hell and back. She'd learned that love could make killers of the gentlest souls, that justice sometimes required stepping outside the law, and that survival often meant becoming something you never imagined you could be. Most importantly, she'd learned that every ending was also a beginning, and that the horizon always held promise for those brave enough to pursue it. The broken gunslinger, the determined mother, and the resilient child rode toward their new life together, carrying hard-won wisdom and unbreakable bonds forged in fire and blood. Behind them, the desert wind began to erase their tracks, gradually removing all evidence of their passage through that harsh and unforgiving land. Ahead lay Colorado, Silver Creek, and the possibility of redemption for those who'd paid the price. Of survival in a world where violence was sometimes the only path to peace. The long road home had finally come to an end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.